Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I explore the current state of modern technology as it interfaces with mental health and mental health care. Reid and I discuss virtual reality, wearable devices, social media, video games, and a lot more. This is also the first episode we've recorded via internet video conference, so fitting that we use technology to discuss technology today. We did this because, unfortunately, Reid caught COVID and was quarantining. But, like the heroic ubermensch that he is, Reid summoned the energy to record an episode. If you enjoy the show, please rate it, subscribe to it, like it, share it, all that stuff. If you have questions, guest suggestions, or you just want to tell us how handsome we are, you can email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. All right, without further preamble, please enjoy the show. Welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. I'm Steve Thayer. That's Reid Robison.
Howdy, Steve.
How's it going? So,
not too bad.
For the people listening, they don't know that something has changed. For the people watching on YouTube, this is not typically the way we record this podcast. We have moved to on the internet for today because Reid got COVID.
Yep. That nasty thing. No,
I was telling him though, he makes Omicron look good. I mean, it hasn't been too bad for you.
Yeah, no. I feel for whoever got hit by this early on, before the era of double, triple vaccinated or whatever we're calling it. But for me, it's been a day or two of a mild cold. I think I sound congested a little bit still, but I feel 99%.
Yeah, I know the day where symptoms were coming on, you could kind of hear it in your voice, and from what I understand, I'm not a physician or anything close to an immunologist. From what I understand, with the Omicron variant, it tends to stay in the upper respiratory system and doesn't drop down into the lower lungs, so people aren't getting the really bad respiratory symptoms like they did with the other variants.
Yeah, thankfully. And you know what, Steve? Everyone is an expert physician, immunologist, virologist these days, so don't worry.
They sure are.
Be anything.
Yeah. Especially on Twitter and Facebook. If you want to find the experts, that's where you go.
Yeah, so we're in a new setting indeed. Hope it sounds good. And I know we were playing around with our lighting beforehand because I looked super orange, but that's not due to COVID. I hope not.
Yeah, hopefully, COVID doesn't change your bilirubin count. I don't know.
I do have this genetic variant, just by way of random tangent, called Gilbert syndrome. It's a genetic variant, a pretty common one, that makes it so certain people with this variant who fast get very mild jaundice after the end of a long fast.
Oh,
and so I think you could detect it in the whites of my eyes if I were doing a good 20+ hour fast, in theory. Or if you check my comprehensive metabolic panel and look if it's one with a bilirubin on it, you could see I run like just over 1.0, a little higher than a typical like 0.8 or 0.9 or whatever people run.
Man, genetics is so fascinating to me. Like, I know that for some of our patients, we will run these genetic tests to help guide prescription decisions. But, we're big fans of Rhonda Patrick and her Found My Fitness organization. And one of the things she'll do is if you send her your genetic code, like I just send her my ancestry data, then and pay a small fee, she'll send you kind of some updated gene indicators, and some of them are COVID related. So I did it, and apparently I've got some genes that are correlated with, or that in recent research are associated with, lower symptom reaction to coronaviruses. So I tend not to get sick. I maybe get sick once every couple of years. So who knows?
It makes sense. That's what determines our architecture, how we're constructed in the world, and it makes sense that we have different susceptibilities. It's probably a strange example to pick, but say you have a genetic variant that gives you a shorter urethra, and you're more prone for UTIs or something like that, or bladder infections. It's interesting in preparation for this episode, because you mentioned you wanted to chat about technology and mental health and some things along those lines. I remembered, I'm like, oh yeah, I had just uploaded my 23andMe data to a new service I randomly stumbled upon called GenoPalate. It was nutritional genomics. There are many out there, but I fed it into there, paid whatever, 30, 40, 50 bucks, something like that, and got this report out. But and I know these tools fairly well, having been in the field for a long time and played with it a lot and sequenced myself and every family member, like we're talking whole genome.
Right.
It was interesting to look at things like I'm a slow metabolizer of alcohol, so I don't need as much. I'm a faster metabolizer of caffeine. I might need a little extra, things like that.
Yeah, I did one a long time ago called DNA Fit, and I think I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. It also, it gives you kind of an estimation on your balance between slow and fast twitch muscle fibers, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So, people with those slower twitch might be, what is it? Might be better at like
Sprinter
endurance.
or endurance, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are cool. And let's make an attempt to segue into our topic. We were talking about digital phenotyping as part of what maybe technology can do for people in health and mental health. The idea like of the quantified self, right? You might wear a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. You might have an app that is listening to your voice, and it can detect if you're talking slower or more softly, and it might say, "Hey, how are you feeling?" To provide your doc with the sort of digital phenotype. One of the many things we'll talk about today in our episode about technology and mental health.
Do you have that feature turned on your Apple Watch where if you fall or it thinks you fell, it's going to offer to call 911 for you?
No, I don't have an Apple Watch, Reid. I have the Garmin Phoenix. Yeah. It's not as smart. It's huge. It's not as smart as the Apple Watch, but I got it for adventure racing and tracking on my mountain climbs and stuff. It saved me once. I was with the Boy Scouts locally, and we were doing a hike, and the guy who was supposed to have the trail all mapped out was taking us on this, like, what I felt like was off the trail. So I pulled up the GPS on my watch and got us back to the trail. So thank you, Garmin.
Yeah, that's impressive. I've used a Garmin when cycling. I really like those, plugging into my Strava. But that's more of, the chest strap and then the cycle-mounted computer.
Right.
But all of that over the past few years is fell by the wayside in favor of my Apple Watch, with the exception of sleep tracking. For me, is I do ditch the watch at night in general and put on an Oura Ring.
Yeah, that's one area where I feel like Apple Watches, for whatever reason, they don't give a crap about sleep tracking, because the other health metrics seem to be pretty good. Like the heart rate tracking spot on. There's a YouTuber.
HRV.
Yeah, they do HRV. There's a YouTuber, what's he call himself? I've told you about him before. I'll post it in the show notes, but he does great reviews on all these wearables, and he'll put on a heart rate monitor. Like, he compared the Apple Watch to the Polar chest strap and showed that the Apple Watch was pretty good at tracking heart rate. And then he'll wear is it an E? What's the brain one for sleep? An EEG?
Yeah, an EEG, polysomnography.
Yeah, he'll wear one of those on his head, and then he'll do comparative tests for sleep stages for like the Oura Ring and he said Fitbit of the wearables, besides the Oura Ring, is probably one of the better sleep tracking devices. But the Oura Ring just came out with their Oura Ring 3. It's been a little controversial from what I understand, because they're switching to a subscription model for the software, which people are pissed about. But
yeah, that's what drew me to them, was the lack of subscription. unlike something like the Whoop strap that some friends use, and I liked the features of. But I do think the Apple Watch has gotten better at its tracking exponentially on a number of fronts, and sleep, in my experience, hasn't been too bad with the Apple Watch. When my Oura Ring was broken, I used it. I've even done some tests, like wearing both just for fun. And, depending on what app you're using, I think it does a good job. Even the phone laying like face down on your bed. Some of the apps use movement during sleep if you're not like sharing the bed or with a pile of people moving all over.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they have that one mattress that now tracks your sleep. There's probably more than one, but the one that you hear advertised in all the podcasts, 8 Sleep. Of course, we're not sponsored by anybody, but that one has tracking built into it. So it just measures, body temperature and movement.
It could get pretty silly once you like put on the 1000 lead EEG cap and you plug in your tracking bed and put the leads on every body part.
Yeah,
and
throw
put
your
on all your
CPAP
wearables.
mask on. Yeah, man. Yeah, with Apple Watch, one of the other challenges I think is battery life, right? Because it's got like maybe a day and a half of battery, and if you wear it at night, it's like, when do you charge it?
Well, that's gotten so much better too. I have the latest, not the latest, but I have like, I don't know, a year-old version. And I got the SE because at first I got the fancy one that did O2, oxygen saturation, in hopes that it would be like a polysomnography sleep study on your wrist.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. You have to actually hit the O2 button. At least when I had the watch initially, hit the O2 button and wait and hold still, and it would fail like most of the time. It was like many new features where these sound like groundbreaking new advances, like an EKG on your watch. But in this soft launch version, it may not be as practically useful yet, but then it gets there.
Yeah. And I think we can apply that same analysis to mental health tech right now. I think with the pandemic, moving a lot of like the delivery of mental health care online has also prompted a lot of the venture capital folks and technologists to think about what other types of technology can we leverage to improve people's mental health. So one of the things that prompted my suggestion of this topic was this Medium article that you and I stumbled across. I can't remember when it was written. I think it was maybe a few years ago.
September. No, it's pretty recent. That Be Your Own Psychologist one.
Oh, yeah. It was the study they cited is a study that maybe happened a few years ago.
The Freud one. Yeah, that's a few years old. 2014, right. I think you're right.
Yeah. So we'll post a link to the show notes to the Medium article, but it was really interesting. So the study, the title of the article was "In VR, You Can Become Your Own Psychologist." And the title of the study that they cite is in Scientific Reports, Conversations Between Self and Self as Sigmund Freud, a Virtual Body Ownership Paradigm for Self-Counseling. And like all good psych studies, they use fun jargon that's not face valid. Not always really obvious what they're talking about in the title.
It was a trippy article to read, a little bit mind-bending, and so that makes me feel a bit better to hear your experience. Because I was just going to defer to you to dissect it because it put me upside down for a second.
Well, so let me try to describe what they did in this study. So they put people in a virtual reality environment. So they put a VR headset on them, and they created an avatar in the VR environment that looked like them. I mean, it wasn't 4K full fidelity graphics, but it looked enough like them to enter an interesting experience. And what they did is they had people talk about their problems, and then they recorded, that audio, and then they would switch bodies and they would look at themselves in virtual reality space, their avatar, say their problems back to them, and then they would offer advice or counsel or comfort to themselves. And then they'd have them switch roles, and now they're watching themselves, VR them, give them this support and counsel. So that was one condition. And in another condition, they did the same thing, except for instead of it being an avatar of them, it was an avatar of Sigmund Freud. And then they lowered the pitch of the audio, so the voice didn't sound exactly like their own voice.
Yeah.
So they're sitting there watching, VR Siggy give them basically, saying the exact thing that they just said to themselves. But what the results suggested was that I think if I remember right, the audio, so the counsel coming from VR Freud led to more symptom reduction, like a decrease in symptom distress compared to it just coming from an avatar that looked like themselves. And also they showed, like in the title was virtual body ownership. They showed that when Freud's movements mimicked their own, and it was synchronous, not asynchronous, and they felt like they were really embodying Freud as therapists, that outcomes were also superior. So that's the summary.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's interesting. Do you think it's related to the other study they cited where they took you out of your body in VR and showed that reduced your fear of death?
Yeah, there's something about embodiment, apparently. It makes me think of our work with psychedelics too, that part of the non-ordinary state of consciousness is a very somatic non-ordinary state as well. A lot of people will experience, especially with ketamine, right, that we use often, this disconnection from embodiment or an altered state of embodiment.
How we experience reality is in an embodied way. Like it's our bodies are our vehicle for everything in life, and our emotions are felt through the body. We live our lives through the body, so it makes sense to me that that these kind of transformational approaches are embodied approaches, and we see that in the therapy world too in general. I mean, sure, we count the brain as a part of the body too. There's some great CBT approaches, but I would lump all that into we gotta get into the form and structure of how we live, how we experience life in order to change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the study that you referenced that takes sort of the VR environment, taking them out of their body, making them less afraid of death. I wonder what the connection there is, because a lot of people will report the same effect after a psychedelic experience, and for a variety of reasons, but I think one of them maybe being that they kind of had a death-like experience. They were exposed to what it might be like for their sense of self, or even their embodied sense of self, to dissolve and disappear.
Yeah, I think you could get at it from a couple different angles. From that kind of loving place of oneness, the experience of oneness during a psychedelic experience, or in theory, another non-ordinary state, maybe even digitally occasioned. But you can get at it from going through a death experience or something a little more terrifying. We're not talking about a fear-based approach necessarily, but overcoming your fear by going through it and coming out on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned the VR environment. It makes me think of the exposure therapy tech. When I think of VR treatments for mental health conditions, that's where my mind usually goes first, because I think that was the early application of VR mental health, was exposure therapy, right? I'm thinking of, when I was in the Air Force, I started my career as a psychologist in the Air Force and went to some VAs, and they demoed this really elaborate VR treatment for PTSD. And I might have talked about it on the podcast before, but for those of you who are new listeners, it was really fascinating. So they wanted to create an immersive environment. This was following the protocol, I think created by Skip Rizzo. He trained me when I went to a training of his when I was in the Air Force for prolonged exposure therapy. He was kind of one of the pioneers of that, if I remember right, and has said a lot about VR exposure therapy for PTSD and phobias and social anxiety and the like. But the rig they had at the time at the VA was a headset, and then they had a chair on a subwoofer that vibrated to mimic the exposure environment was a caravan or a convoy. So, you're in a Humvee in the VR environment, you're looking around. The graphics were terrible, but enough. And you're holding a mock weapon, and they even had smells. So they had a little diffuser with smells like body odor and blood and burning car tires and spices that were in the Middle East, commonly found over there. And they run these guys and gals through this scenario, and it evokes a lot of emotion, as you might imagine, especially if you have trauma related to such an event. And then the therapist coaches them to move through and manage and habituate to, at least in the prolonged exposure model, the fear response. And apparently it was pretty effective, although like a lot of government contracts, they bought a bunch of these VR machines, then most of the therapists didn't use them.
That sounds intense and therefore potentially pretty effective. It reminds me of the other exposure therapies I've seen in demos and seen around for quite some time, like fear of heights. It's a lot easier to take someone into a virtual environment than the side of a real building. Or if you have a fear of planes, it's a lot easier to work with your client that way. Let's put on some VR goggles and go there, maybe even measuring some biofeedback parameters as we go, rather than renting a whole airplane to do some exposure therapy.
Yeah, and I think that's potentially one of the really big advantages of VR and tech therapy for a condition like this. I remember watching a video of a guy, CBT therapist, specialized in phobias, and it was of him with his patient on an airplane. I mean, they rented out an airplane to go do exposure for fear of flying. So imagine not having to do that, just instead putting on an Oculus Quest headset and hooking up some biofeedback tech, and you're off to the races.
You don't need that collection of big furry spiders in your office anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
New era.
Well, and it's great for the exposure hierarchy, because you could just start with something low poly or something low threat and then ramp it up with smells if you wanted to, or more vivid imagery.
Yeah. First, have you been on the ride at Disneyland soaring over California?
Yeah.
For some reason, this discussion just reminds me of it, because you sit on this like ski lift in front of a big IMAX style screen. But then as you're flying over the orange fields in California, they blow orange essential oil aroma in your face.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a good trick.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids ride. I don't remember where this happened. It was in my childhood. Maybe it was Universal.
Oh, I've been
Studios.
there, yeah.
But I remember getting sprayed in the face at one point. It terrified the hell out of me.
And they have these little snaky things that'll slap the back of your ankles
Right.
or something and make hissing sounds. I don't remember if it was spiders or snakes or something like that, but that was one where it was sufficiently shocking that as kids we would just go back and do it over and over.
Oh yeah. Well, you were talking about the embodied experience earlier, like when, especially with respect to trauma, when something happens to us, it's not just encoded in the hippocampus as a memory, right? It's in the entire body. And so it makes sense to treat it at the level of the entire body. And so I think introducing other, what am I trying to say? Like, other senses, I guess. You got the VR goggles on, and you got the smell, and you got sound, and you got touch, and maybe even taste, who knows? If you're trying to get over some kind of picky eating or food restriction, maybe you could introduce that.
Oh yeah, I could think of so many different applications. When you talk about food alone, like in eating disorders.
Mm-hmm.
But it also reminds me of something you said earlier about the psychedelic experience, and just makes me think of how the psychedelic experience is a complete sensory experience, or it's this full flowering expression of like all your senses firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, it's a blitz. And for some people, going through that gauntlet of a sensory experience is, I think, in part what can be helpful about the psychedelic experience. It's like if I can go through that and come out on the other end, I can survive anything.
Yeah, or even so, it could be that, or it could be a blissful one if you're one who likes that, or one who has a lot of experience navigating it to the point where you know you're not going to die, or you know you got this. The sensory experiences can be quite pleasant as well.
Yeah, well, and for our clients who are really, really depressed, right? And they come in for ketamine assisted therapy, and the ketamine helps them experience bliss for the first time in recent memory. It shows them that it can be done, right? It reminds them what it feels like.
Yep.
And at an entire 5 sense level.
I put something on my Instagram the other day. I haven't been posting much lately, but new year, new you. Gotta get it out there. No,
follow Interspace Doctor on Instagram.
I said something like psychedelics are way showers. Just a concept that you and I have talked about many times, or in our CAP trainings, but especially early on, those early psychedelic experiences can show you the path or point the way, or open up those pathways that then you can follow once again during your integration work, perhaps.
So, can we use a VR experience designed to mimic a psychedelic one as maybe a stepping stone? That's what I'm wondering. Like, if we got somebody who's really nervous about trying ketamine, or, in the future we got psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or whatever, can we say, well, put on these goggles. This is what it's like to be on DMT, at least some approximation of it. And there are apps out there, right? We've mentioned them before, but Tripp VR is one of them that our colleague Sonny Strasberg's involved in, right?
Soundself, that's the one that you demoed. Robin, the founder, had mailed us one. Yeah, he's such a bright and fun guy, and that's the one where you make toning sounds into it, and in the VR experience, your avatar is sitting there meditating under a tree, and there's a mic hooked to the VR glasses and headphones and everything. And as you make sound, and as you breathe, and as you get deeper and deeper into this, you start floating from the ground up towards the tree branches, and then eventually you blast through, and pretty soon you're just flying through this tunnel of fractals, and it continues to respond to your toning or oming or chanting along with your breathing. It's pretty wild.
I liked Soundself because of that, because it was responsive to the user. It was not a passive experience, right? It was a participative experience. And I think it's on, we demoed that a while ago. I think it's actually on the Oculus Quest now. I think you can get it as an app.
And if you for the clinicians out there, especially CAP clinicians, if anyone's a part of the Big Tent ketamine listserv, this was within the last month or two. A colleague and friend of ours from another state, from Texas, Rakesh Jain, talked about his experience with Soundself and said it was really profound and transformative. So I would say that to answer your question, that yes, some of these VR apps, tools, and technologies could be used as a preparatory stepping stone, if not even a more limited proxy for a psychedelic experience. They could be, or start to approximate, a non-ordinary state. Even though it's debatable. Like, I even went on Psychedelics Today earlier. Our friends from Psychedelics Today, who we've been talking to lately, they had an article on there called Psychedelic VR Will Not Give You a Psychedelic Trip. But the title was just, that was an article I think has been on there a little while, and it's also a catchy title, but they point out that in the current state, it's not the same, but I can tell you that some of them are getting there.
Yeah. They're trippy, especially when if you put on a haptic vest, which they have for some of the games, right? So it's a vest that has, I don't know what the technology is, probably speakers. And if you get shot in the game, in the chest, in that area on the haptic, this is like Ready Player One, right? It gives you some haptic feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine wearing one of those guys, and you've got the music that's playing with your trippy visual experience, and you're feeling it in your body. You probably wouldn't have to even microdose to have a trippy experience with something like that. Well, and you can even think of sound bathing. You go to your local yoga studio and you got somebody who's really good at the crystal bowls, and you're breathing like that can get trippy, and you're not ingesting any substances.
Yeah, and just to tie it back into the embodiment, those sound waves are kind of moving through you, like as a full body sound experience, or like sound bath is a good term for it.
Which has got to be affecting your nervous system in a direct way, right? I think you mentioned what's the sound table that you can lie on that you have?
Yeah, mine's several years old. There are some fancy brands making fancy looking ones these days, but the one I have is a vibroacoustic table where the sound gets pumped through these like pneumatic tubes, and so it vibrates the sound table to the music. And we did even pair that experimentally with Soundself when we had the device, to make it more of a full body experience. But next time we record, I don't know if I'll really do this, but I have a big gong down the hall. Maybe I'll get it out, put it behind me, and when our time's up, I'll give it a whack.
Yeah, I'm down. That sounds good to me. Well, back to my notes. I really like the idea of using VR technology to. I think it can add a lot, especially to therapies that involve have an exposure component. But then there's the AI component, right? We got AI technology, and like when I think of AI, my mind usually goes to the Terminator movies, of activating Skynet and then we're all dead, or Ex Machina, the robots that pass the Turing test that know us better than we know ourselves, or that movie with Joaquin Phoenix, Her. I don't think I saw that one, but from what I understand of the plot, it was he basically falls in love with Siri.
You didn't see it?
No, I haven't seen it.
It was a little creepy.
Well, I think all of them are a little creepy because, the idea of us creating, of us creating a silicon-based intelligence that can learn at speeds many orders of magnitude faster than we can, that would, make decisions that it was, the decisions that would be based on coding decisions we made long ago that we could not have possibly predicted the outcome of which, like, all that's super terrifying, right? But it's also super promising, has the potential to be. So what we have now in the form of AI therapists are sort of just clunky chatbots. Have you ever come across any of these apps that are supposed to, basically be a Siri therapist?
When the age of chatbots began, I got pretty excited because I've always been intrigued by the question, how much of the talk therapy process, how much of these, like say these gold standard approaches to certain mental health struggles, like CBT for binge eating disorder, for example, how much of that could we automate and make so widely accessible that individuals who need it can access it, and then how much needs the art and science of a real human on the other end. And so when chatbots came along, I was really hopeful, but then, and there was some funding in the venture world getting pumped into it. I think I was even playing around with the technology a little bit, but then all of a sudden it just didn't take off. It didn't stick for whatever reason.
And there's some tech that's still out there. I think there's still activity in this space, but yeah, I remember the excitement kind of ebbing and flowing. Although I did have one client So this is a person who had really severe OCD and social anxiety. And sometimes in a session, they would not be able to speak for 30 minutes at a time, overwhelmed with anxiety. And during the sessions when they could speak, they would describe it feeling like a sandstorm in their mind, just being in the presence, even though we had a good relationship of trust, a good therapeutic rapport, good working relationship. This person, if they were triggered, their brain would just grind to a halt. But they would show me their notes that they'd take between sessions, and the notes were super articulate, very insightful. This person had a good, very introspective. And so sometimes, I would basically do therapy to the older version of this person recorded in their notes. And then they got this app called Youper, and it's not just a chat bot. It does other things, but that's the feature that they used. And apparently it was more useful than me. They were getting a lot of benefit. And I looked at it, and basically what it was is it's a procedurally generated list of a couple of different responses that it doesn't react at least from what I understood at the time, super intelligently to what you're putting in. It just says some CBT-like things back to you. So it starts with, you type in how you're feeling. That must be really hard for you. Or, it helps you challenge some cognitive distortions. Most of them are sort of based on cognitive behavioral therapy. And she found it pretty useful.
Yeah. They have been studied and tested and shown some pretty impressive efficacy. Like we were talking earlier about the example of Woebot, an AI-powered chatbot designed to treat substance use disorders. And you could see how if you feed a robot a manualized approach, like motivational enhancement, like a manualized approach for a given specific substance, and you narrow the focus on something that a robot could do fairly well. The psychoeducation, the check-ins, the core CBT pieces that really were most effective in human-to-human therapy, they were able to deliver on, and there was some good data.
Yeah, some of the data, they were comparing the Woebot outcomes. I think they were using the Working Alliance Inventory, which is a measure I know well. I used it in my dissertation. And the PHQ-2. And they compared Woebot results to just results from some CBT studies, and they were comparable. So there's promise there. I got to point out, Reid, that's the second time you've said CBD, so I'm wondering where your mind is.
Well, can I blame COVID?
Sure. Oh, that's true.
I didn't even take any CBD today.
Maybe you should. I'm not a doctor, but maybe it's a good anti-inflammatory from what I hear.
Yeah, why not? On the chatbot thing, this isn't technically a chatbot, but there are some digital therapeutics that have even made it to market. Like one we've talked about and a lot in clinic and prescribed a time or two is called Somryst, which is CBT, not CBD, CBTI for insomnia. And you can write a prescription and your client will get this link to a platform app and work through the CBTI approaches. It's pretty cool.
Well, and there are video games that are FDA approved as treatment for ADHD that you can prescribe, and there's some VR treatments that I think are also prescribable, insurance reimbursable.
Yeah, it's funny to think about how far-reaching the tech and mental health topics go. Like I'm just remembering when I used to own neurofeedback equipment back early in my career. I was working with a lot of teens with ADHD, and I had this technology I was kind of both using with clients and playing with personally. Like they say, people need their own psychedelic experience. You kind of need to know what neurofeedback feels like if you're going to dish it out. But I remember sitting there with this cap on and controlling this plane with my brain waves, trying to get it to like take off by settling into the right balance of like delta, theta, beta brain waves.
Yeah, biofeedback is a pretty powerful tool. We had a biofeedback center or kind of area at Brigham Young University where I went to graduate school. At their counseling center, had a whole biofeedback operation, and they had some of that same equipment. And you'd watch, you'd either gamify it or you'd at least just watch the lines go up and down based on your skin conductance and your heart rate and brain waves.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and clearly, it's been around a while for ADHD, and it just takes patience and persistence. But I find it to be, a great modality if you have both those. Well, those things can be hard to come by with ADHD, but if the parent or caregiver has those things to help support you in doing enough of it. But neurofeedback for working through trauma is also really interesting, both on the brainwave and the biofeedback level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do we think AI chatbots are going to take our jobs, Reid? I don't know.
Sadly, we got to keep on doing our things.
Unfortunately, we can't hand off healing minds to AI chatbots.
But it is a question I think about a lot. Not how to pawn off my job on a robot, but like as we work on bringing, evidence-based, holistic, integrative mental health services to as many people as possible. What are the parts that can be delivered more effectively by technology, and what parts need that real human interaction? And even then, what parts need in person in this in this COVID era, and what parts can be done remotely, which is we're realizing is more and more.
Yeah, my mind went to this sort of digital phenotyping we were talking about with wearables, or even the way they do some psych research now. Like a lot of the positive psychology research is done via app, and the app will ping you throughout the day asking you how you're feeling, which we know that a lot of what we think we know about psychology and mental health is based on self-report, right? Somebody comes into your office and you ask them, tell me how you're feeling. So that's not a super reliable source of information. Human beings are not real good at accurate self-report. And if, let's say, as a therapist, you're seeing a person once a week for psychotherapy, what you're really getting is how they're feeling right then. You're not getting a great sample of how they've been feeling throughout the week or how they've been behaving or functioning throughout the week. And so, there's a lot of mood tracking apps out there nowadays that do more than just track your mood. They suggest interventions and things like that. But getting that kind of data, I think, could be super useful. You can get data on how people are taking their meds, how compliant they are with treatment. I know that word compliance is some people hate that word, but whether or not they're actually doing the stuff that they say they're going to do in therapy or that you'd like them to do, and then how they're feeling throughout the week. I've used one of those apps before. I actually made one once called Mood Rocket that we never brought to market, but
it's a good name.
And my company's name was Mood Vitals. I thought it was super clever. We never actually went forward with it, but yeah, it gave you this dashboard that sort of showed you how your mood changed over the week. And so you can bring that in, and if you track outcomes, if you're pretty reliable at tracking it, you say, I don't think I'm really getting better, but you can show the client, well, actually your scores on these measures that we've been doing, or if the tech gets really up there, your biometrics that we've been measuring have been improving. We were kind of talking about this with Amy De La Garza last episode, but and then you can actually show them some real evidence, and then they're like, oh, well, maybe I am getting better, and that can make a difference.
Yeah, no, I have lots of opinions on all that. I'm probably 250 clinical trials deep into my career, and I just love self-report scales, even though I see the beauty and the need of a good clinician administered measure. But we can just collect so much more data, self-report, and in this wearable era, it opens up a whole new realm of what's possible, what can be collected even passively. But one example I'll give is a company called AliveCor. They have a product called Cardia Mobile. It's I have one, and you may have seen it, and some of our colleagues at Novamind have it too. It's an EKG for the iPhone that is actually really good, but they did a study that showed that if you have like dozens or hundreds of EKGs done on someone throughout a day, and you compare it to like one EKG read by a cardiologist versus hundreds read by a robot, the hundreds read by a robot wins way better. Just because of all those different data points at different times in the real world, compared to that one snippet. I think the same probably applies to mood. That's a tricky thing to pinpoint at one millisecond in time when you're sitting there with a clinician in your office.
Yeah. Well, I think in as much as a diagnosis can be made by pattern recognition, it'll probably be made better by a robot than a person. Like you think of, I'm hearing that radiology, like reading x-rays is, in the next 10 years, it's going to be AI robots reading those things better than any human eye could. Or dermatology, certain patterns on the skin that you give the AI algorithm enough reps and it's going to be able to know us better than we know ourselves. They're using neuralistic programming, what's the NLP, natural linguistic program. I don't know.
Or do you mean natural language processing to extract patterns from text, like narrative text notes?
Right. To see like, what is it about therapy that actually works? And because a lot of therapy is speech, right? Not all of it, but a lot of it is.
Yeah. And in this telehealth era, it's interesting when we do therapy with a client and they're in their own home, you get a whole nother set of variables that you didn't have before. Like, what does their environment look like? All of a sudden you get a little glimpse into their world when their significant other walks by in the middle of a session and bops them on top of the head with a magazine or something.
Right.
Or when some a kid with a phobia you're seeing like points at the closet behind him and says, "That's what I'm scared of," that door with all the monsters behind it or something like that.
And then you can say, okay, let's I'm here with you on the camera. Let's go into the closet, right? Which you couldn't have done that in your office. So yeah, the advantages I think are apparent there.
Yeah, there are pros and cons like we like to talk about. I have no idea who or what I'm making eye contact with currently. Maybe if I stare at the webcam, that little white dot.
Yeah, I was joking around. We were in some training this morning for a research project that we're doing, and we were in a breakout session. And I was joking around with one of our research managers that she was really good. Like I was looking at her on my computer screen, but her eyes were looking at my eyes, and I'm like, "You must be staring at your webcam." And she said, "No, I just minimize everything in the screen, and then I move it up to the top of my screen right underneath the webcam, so it looks more like I'm looking at you in the webcam." That was a good strat.
Yeah, and that is actually how the window is set up for me right now. There's two little boxes of us, but still, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm looking at the screen, not the webcam sitting on top of it, but I don't know how perceptible it is, what that margin of error is.
I remember when we moved a lot of our clients to telehealth at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was really concerned about that, right? Because we're not really making eye contact. There's this, not only the physical removal of not being in the same room with them, but there's also, there's some normal things that our brains evolved to interpret based on looking at somebody's eyes that maybe we're not getting. Because, right, for the people who are watching on YouTube, they're watching me look to my right at your face because I'm talking to you. instead of up into the camera, right? I don't know. I don't know what the implications are, but it's weird.
We'll see what the implications of the pandemic are over the next few years. I suppose we're already seeing some of them.
Well, Reid, any other thoughts about? I mean, we could talk for hours, of course. There's a lot. Well, there was one other study that I just thought was really cool that I wanted to just talk about real quick. It was using VR to treat schizophrenia. I was telling you about this before we hit record. So I think that the title of the article was Virtual Reality Therapy for Refractory Auditory Verbal Hallucinations in Schizophrenia, a Pilot Clinical Trial. So what they did, kind of like with that Freud self-therapist VR study we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, they had the patient tell the clinician in as much detail as they could let's say it's an auditory hallucination, what their most distressing voice says to them, what it sounds like. The clinician would take notes, and then the clinician would record some audio. Well, no, that's not how they did it. They put the patient into the VR environment, and then they had the patient describe what the voice might look like, or they created an avatar that represented this hallucination. So the patient is confronted with the avatar that represents their hallucination, and then the therapist is voicing the avatar in real time and having a conversation with the patient based on sort of this this idea that they've gotten from the patient based on the interview of what the things that this voice might say to the patient. And so at first, the clinician is really aggressive and mean, just like the voice typically is. And then the patient is coached to regulate their emotions. They're coached to be assertive in some self-esteem strategies to kind of stand up to this bullying hallucinatory voice. And then as sessions progress, the clinician, as the hallucination kind of changes their stance toward the patient, and they become more collaborative. And the idea is that, this person with psychotic hallucinations is changing their relationship to the voice, right? And the outcomes were pretty good. I'm going to look at my notes here. Reduction of audio-visual hallucination symptoms and distress related to the hallucination, and beliefs about voices improved significantly, both for the related beliefs of omnipotence and malevolence. General symptoms of depression improved, and quality of life improved. So
that's fascinating.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think we even take a full inventory of all the ways technology is involved in what we do in mental health, and the potential for advancements is huge. Your study you just mentioned reminds me of something I read about AI and big data in psychiatry, where this one study looked at the analysis of speech sound waves was able to predict with like an 85% accuracy whether or not someone was going to have a psychotic break. We talk about that risk with psychedelics, with cannabis and young people. But 83% accuracy of predicting whether or not someone's at risk for psychosis based on their use of like possessive pronouns and speech and these other variables. That's pretty impressive. It's way better than a COVID antigen accuracy rate.
Right. Yeah. Imagine the applications for, maybe the app can catch when you're descending into a major depressive episode, or on the other end of the spectrum, up into a manic episode before you could, or before your partner could, or something like that.
Yeah. Things have come a long way. In med school, I co-created with some colleagues, because we were computer nerd geeks. I know there's a distinction. We're probably both back then. We created the medical student informatics group, and our mentor was Homer Warner, who is the founder of medical informatics. He's since passed away, but such a an amazing fellow, and there's actually a statue of him in the Health Sciences Library at the University of Utah med school, where he's in the statue is standing there holding like a Palm Pilot, because he's the one who brought the first computers into healthcare by bringing this like room-sized massive computer for a couple $100,000 into a hospital in Salt Lake City, and taught it to analyze a heartbeat. But it's amazing to look back at how far we've come, and I have no idea what it'll look like in another 10, 20, 100 years.
Who knows? Maybe Elon will win and we'll all have neural nets implanted and we can read each other's minds.
Yeah, I'll see you and Elon in a Fortnite concert, like Ariana Grande and Travis Scott recently did in there.
Well, that's actually an interesting point. Our video game technology, just how immersive entertainment technology is. What kind of effect is that having on our brains, especially the brains of young children, right? I mean, you mentioned before the call that a couple of your kids were playing Fortnite in the background, and I'm pretty sure my son's doing the same. But yeah, I mean, you can attend a concert in Roblox. You can attend a concert in Fortnite. You can attend it in VR. My kids are on, we have an Oculus, and they log on to VR chat, and they've got friends on VR chat. They were able to make friends with people all over the world, and there's there's the anxiety as a parent, like, who the hell are these people, and how do I protect my kid from weirdos? And I mean, I saw this meme. It was like, the meme. I feel like a very old person trying to describe a meme to you people, but it was basically making the joke that we were so concerned about being too close to the television screen when we were young. I remember having a TV that didn't have a remote, had physical buttons that you pushed for the channels. So if you were one of the lucky ones in my family, you got to lie down at in front of the TV with your foot, changing the channels with your toes, because you didn't want to have to bother to get up and push it with your thumb. And so that was like really close to the screen. And now we have, VR screens that are 2 inches or 2 centimeters from our eyeballs. Who knows how it's wiring our brains?
The brave new world. That's probably the wrong reference to use.
Yeah, hopefully not.
But it is worrisome. Like it's cool that you can have a concert like Lil Nas X gets on Roblox and does a concert that's been watched 30 million times, and you've done that with like Marshmello, Travis Scott, Ariana Grande, and these, and they do try to make it like this is a violent-free zone in Fortnite, where you go to Party Island and you got all the other Rick and Morty Ricks dancing with their banana backpacks or whatever. It's a weird but fun scene, and a lot of kids are spending a lot of time in there and interacting in new ways that we don't quite understand the implications, but there are some for sure.
One of them that I think about is, the potential benefits, but also risks for kids who are by disposition to kind of introverted or socially anxious. Because for a lot of them, being in these virtual environments, they really come out of their shells. They thrive in these virtual environments because it takes away some of what makes them anxious in a social environment. They're not physically present. They can be an avatar that doesn't look like them. You have people in games like Second Life. And again, there are lots of potential negatives, but for somebody who without that would have been maybe socially isolated, maybe it's a gift. Maybe it's a blessing that they can do this.
Yeah. I think it just brings up for me the fact that technology could be a curse or a blessing, depending on how it's used. And I'm certainly grateful for the technology that helps, fight certain diseases and connect us with loved ones across the globe when we can't, and so many other things. But also we've got to make sure we've got that healthy level of awareness around everything that's creeping into our lives.
Yeah, especially the technology that hijacks our nervous system. Who who is it? Tristan Harris. He's the one that was a big part of the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix. And he has a podcast called Your Divided Attention, I think it is. I can't remember. Yeah. But he's sort of one of the most outspoken folks about the dangers of social media technology, and he calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem, where you have AIs that are feeding you content on your Twitter feed or Facebook feed or TikTok feed or whatever it is, that's designed to either make you afraid or outrage you, because that's the stuff that keeps you glued to the screen so that they can keep feeding you, so they can make money off their ad revenue. And he makes the point that it's created the polarized political, mess that we're in right now, and people, it's amplifying our natural tendency toward othering, toward tribalism, which probably isn't super healthy for a global culture. So lots of possible, like we were saying, pros, but also lots of possible cons.
Yeah, and that maybe we should dive in deep on the topic of dopamine one of these days, and how that keeps us glued to some of this stuff. But yeah, I think overall it's really impressive what technology has brought in terms of both the positive treatment interventions and also like the widespread ubiquitous use that we need to keep a close eye on and make sure it's not having too far-reaching and negative effects.
Yeah. Well, Reid, I think appropriate that we have our conversation about technology on our first over-the-internet recording of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. Thanks for listening, everybody. Reid, I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. Fun to chat with you, Steve. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.